Beyond Big Pharma. Before we get Pam Killeen in here, let's hear that Bobby Kennedy Jr. clip again, talking about this study on the Amish and rates of autism.
There was a researcher, a writer named Dan Olmsted, and he was very curious about unvaccinated populations, and the Amish are one of those populations. So he went and he did a study of the Amish in Lancaster, Pennsylvania, Lancaster County, Pennsylvania, and there should have been, I think, about, if it was following the national trends, there should have been about 2,000 autism cases, and they were able to find 3, and all of them were children.
All right, let's bring Pam Killeen, health and wellness coach, co-author of The Great Bird Flu Hoax and the host of the Circadian Reboot with Pam Killeen podcast. Pam, welcome back. How are you?
I'm great. I'm happy to be here, but not happy to report on this story, unfortunately. This is something that's been in the news now for many, many years, ever since Andrew Wakefield. I don't know if you remember Andrew
yes.
Wakefield.
I interviewed Andrew, yes.
Fantastic. Yeah, back in 1998. Now, Richard, when you hear Andrew Wakefield speak, there's a ring of truth to what he is saying. And yet he was vilified for his findings when he connected the dots between vaccines and autism. In fact, he lost his medical license for his exposure. And he's still active. I don't know if you know this, but he's still active. He's making documentaries about the risks associated with vaccines. And now you're talking here, and Robert Kennedy is talking here about a fellow by the name of Dan Olmsted. Now, Dan Olmsted, he was tipped off by a resident in the area where the Amish were living, a guy by the name of Dick Warner. And Dick Warner, he had a water purification system that he sold to the Amish. And he was very, very close with the Amish. And when he was living with them, befriending them, he noticed that he didn't see any autistic children. And somehow or another, he leaked this information to Dan Olmsted. And sure enough, exactly what RFK is saying is that there's a very, very rare incidence of autism among the Amish, and the minority of the Amish are vaccinating. So they still don't have a large majority of people at all that are vaccinating among the Amish, because the Amish, as you know, tend to rely more on Mother Nature. And so I'm sure there's a few variables that need to be addressed here as to why there is a lower rate of autism among the Amish. I mean, these Amish children probably aren't on screens all day long. They're probably outside in the fresh air as well. They're probably eating, not in every case, but in many cases, I'm sure they're eating more traditional whole foods. So there's a lot of variables to address here, but certainly what happened with Dan Olmsted and what RFK is referring to here is that these cases were reported by doctors, by local doctors, who also noticed that their patient base had very, very few cases of autism. So it's not just Dan Olmsted who's reporting on this. It's not RFK Jr. who's reporting on this. I've also heard over the years, Richard, I'm sure you have as well, where in these communities, the Mennonite communities and so on, where they are relying more on Mother Nature, that they tend to have far fewer cases of autism.
Right. I went online and of course, kind of the usual suspects, factcheck.org and some place called Public Health Communications Collaborative. Their headlines: anti-vaccine myth that Amish children don't have autism. False claim about cause of autism highlighted. Basically trying to debunk this idea. First of all, some of them are claiming that the autism rates in the Amish community are about the same as they are that are reported or comparable to rates reported in other populations. I don't know. But it stands to reason, to me anyway, that the Amish would not have the same incidence of vaccination rates. I can't imagine the Amish, eschewing so many sort of, modern conveniences and modern living and so forth, and yet they would line up to get vaccinated. I doubt that very much. The other thing you mentioned about Andrew Wakefield, and people don't understand, Andrew Wakefield in that study that was published in Lancet, I think it was Lancet, he never said that the MMR vaccines cause autism. He says there's something going on here and it deserves further attention. And for that, they took his medical license away.
Exactly. And you fast forward from 1998 to today, and now we have RFK saying, yeah, let's just look into this. There are a lot of angry soccer moms out there, and they're the ones who have been going to the Children's Health Defense and Robert Kennedy and saying, something's wrong with my child. And, I talked to my grandparents, and my grandparents said we didn't have this problem back in the 1930s, the 1940s, that this is a new problem. And so the soccer moms are out there who are advocating for more research, for more responsibility being laid with these vaccine companies. I mean, they are basically unscathed through all of this. They just hand out these vaccines willy-nilly, and the research behind them is actually quite thin, and there's no accountability. So I know under Trump and RFK, they're talking about making them more accountable for adverse reactions, where right now they really don't have any culpability whatsoever. So it's really got to change. They need to be putting more responsibility behind a lot of these things. They say that there's no thimerosal or mercury in these vaccines, and I don't know about that, but there probably is some aluminum in there, and aluminum is very neurotoxic. So they're injecting potentially very toxic metals in these injections. And I think the average consumer has no idea about that.
I had Dr. Robert Malone on the program a couple of weeks ago. We were talking about Bobby Kennedy's confirmation, Health and Human Services Secretary, and his pledge to investigate, vaccines, vaccines. And I asked Dr. Malone, is it possible, do they have the data where they can look at vaccinated populations versus unvaccinated populations and then compare health outcomes in those two groups? And he seems confident that data exists, particularly with the military, the armed forces. They keep, pretty strict notes on all of that sort of thing. So, maybe we're going to get to the bottom of this finally. But we have to be allowed to ask the questions. Like, okay, so maybe the autism rates are not, zero in the Amish community, but maybe they're somewhat lower, significantly lower. It's worth examining, but why are people so afraid to even ask questions? I don't understand.
Well, it's character assassinations. This is what they've been doing for several decades now. You're kind of a kook if you speak out against or question vaccines. And the same thing with fluoride. These are two things that are allegedly safe and effective and really have very little research behind them, that people just don't know that. People think the same of fluoride as the same of vaccines. And when you look at the mantra associated with both of them, that these are things that are supposed to be safe and effective, and then when you do a little digging, you find out they really aren't, it's a scary place to be. People want to feel protected. They desperately want to feel protected, and they hope that the government is there to protect us. Unfortunately, what's pushing the government is a lot of lobbyists who have money. They have money on their minds. They want to make money. There's a lot of money to be made because of fluoride, and there's a lot of money to be made because of vaccines. And the other thing, it takes responsibility away from ourselves, that if we think, oh, I'm going to go get a vaccine, therefore I can eat all this junk food and I'll be fine because I'm getting a vaccine. No, we need to be taking more responsibility for our own health, and we cannot be relying on these vaccines because we simply don't have the research to prove that they're as safe and effective as they claim that they are, and they're just not.
Well, speaking of fluoride, Utah, this just came across the wire, Utah is poised to become the first state to place a complete ban on community water fluoridation. They've proposed a bill, and so we'll have to leave it there, Pam, but maybe
I have more good news, though. There's 60 communities right now, 60 communities in the United States talking about banning fluoride.
There you go. Okay. Pam Killeen is a health and wellness coach, co-author of The Great Bird Flu Hoax, and host of the Circadian Reboot with Pam Killeen podcast. PamKilleen.com. Pam Killeen, KILLEEN, PamKilleen.com. Always a pleasure. We'll talk again next week.
Thanks, Richard.